Hello, it's April 21st.
2006.
And I'm interviewing Grandpa.
April 21st, 2006. Grandpa Sol Krasner. Hi, Grandpa.
Hi,
Where were you born?
I was born in St. Louis, Missouri,
On what day?
June 14th, 1923.
Do you remember?
Flag Day.
And what is your favorite memory of being born?
Not only do I not remember the day I was born, I don't remember what happened yesterday.
And who were your parents?
My parents were Besheva and Tevye Krasner. My
And-
mother's maiden name was DeWaskin. And in St. Louis, Missouri, at one time, there were a large number of Krasners and DeWaskins, two big families that settled in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. And where were they from?
They were all from Stetlach in Ukraine, which are these little shtetls were very close to Kiev. That's a big city. Yes, and if you saw Fiddler on the Roof, you have an idea of what the Jewish shtetls were like. I guess, because I never saw it.
Do you know the names of the shtetls?
No.
Okay. And what did your father do?
My father, like all Jewish boys at that time and place, after his bar mitzvah became an apprentice to some tinner. And being an apprentice meant that you lived in the tinner in your employer's house with his family, and he trained you for, I think it was about 3 years. My
Mhm.
father was trained as a tinner. That is, he made things out of sheet metal.
Mm-hmm. And what are your earliest childhood memories?
My earliest childhood memories were about, well, there's one thing that stands out in my mind, but it's a very isolated incident. When I was 3 years old, approximately, my three cousins who were contemporaries of mine and I all went to the Jewish hospital in St. Louis and had our tonsils taken out. Because in those days, tonsils were removed even if you didn't need to have them removed. They were thought to be a source of infection, I guess. That's the only memory I have from that period of time. Then I have memories of my years from 10 to 13 in St. Louis. Some memories.
And who you lived with cousins in St. Louis?
Oh yeah, well you see, there were about 4 Krasner families and a very large number of DeWaskin families, all settled in that area of St. Louis. And there was one huge set of families. Actually, the Krasners did not interact too much with the DeWaskins, but there was some interaction. But I was in the Krasner group.
What were the names of your cousins?
My contemporary, oops, Gesundheit. My contemporaries were Oscar Krasner was my favorite, and your dad knows him well. He was a master jokester. And then there was Henry Rubanowitz, who was the son of my mother's sister, Pessy. And there was, let's see, I named Oscar and Henry, and Fuzzy. Fuzzy was the son of another Krasner, Sam Krasner. No, I think his name was Simon. I knew only the Yiddish name, and I can't remember what it was. So we three were the closest in age of all the Krasners, and we did a lot of things together. I'm sorry to say that Oscar, who everybody called Usher, and Henry are both deceased now. And Fuzzy sort of got separated from the family many years ago. He was living somewhere in Illinois, southern part of Illinois, and I've lost track of him. I don't know if he's still living or not.
Okay. And who was your favorite baseball team when you lived in St.
There's
Louis?
no doubt about that. The Gas House Gang, the St. Louis Cardinals, and I belonged to the Knothole Gang. That was a section. The Cardinals had a section of the bleachers, the left field bleachers, set aside for poor kids like me. We could go in for free. And in those days, the Cardinals were called the Gas House Gang. I don't know how they got that name, but I could name most of the players on the team, and I worshipped all of them, especially the left fielder, because he was right in front of us, Joe Medwick. But then there was Frankie Frisch, who played second base. Pepper Martin played third base. Leo DeRocher played shortstop, and a guy named Collins, I think, played first base. I don't remember who the pet catcher was, but we worshipped them, especially Medwick, because he was very friendly with the Knothole Gang. He used to sometimes throw balls up to us. When I left St. Louis at the age of 13, I lost all interest in baseball.
Did you ever catch a ball?
No.
Did Med? So why did you like Medwick so much?
Because our seats were close to where he played, left field, and he had a good sense of humor, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever meet Dizzy Dean, or was that later?
Oh, I forgot to tell you, Dizzy Dean and Paul Dean, the Dean brothers. Dizzy Dean was a famous pitcher.
Mm-hmm.
Never met him. I never met any of them personally.
And why did your family leave St. Louis?
Well, this was the Depression. This was really, it was the later stages of the Depression. The Depression reached its low point in 1933, and we left in 36. So I guess we were just beginning to come out of it. But it was very difficult to find work. And my father was influenced by his sister and her husband, who lived in Chicago. They said that their jobs were more plentiful in Chicago, so we moved there, and my father did find work.
And how many brothers and sisters did you have?
One sister and 3 brothers.
What were their names?
I'll name it in order of the year of birth. Sam was the oldest. He was 10 years older than I, and I didn't interact with him too much. He had different friends. And the next one was Leon. I interacted with him a lot because he sort of acted as a father figure to me. Then there was William. We were friends, but he also had his own friends, his age group. And then there was my sister Lil.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you all move to Chicago?
Yes.
Where did you live in Chicago?
We lived in the Humboldt Park neighborhood, near Northwest Side. That was partly Jewish community, but a lot of Polish people lived around there, and Irish, and a lot of different ethnic groups.
And how did you get along with the people there?
Oh, very well, very well. Our next door neighbor was, we lived on, right next to Humboldt Park, 1 block away from Humboldt Park. And our next door neighbor was a Polish family. We were very friendly with them, and they were very friendly with us.
What was their name?
I can't remember right now.
Mm-hmm. How long were you in Chicago?
Well, we were in Chicago until about, I would say about our family was in Chicago until about 1939, thereabouts, 1940,
Mm-hmm.
when my mother and when the family as a whole moved to Los Angeles. My sister was married at that time, and she stayed in Chicago. Oh, and my brother Sam was also married. He stayed in Chicago, but the rest of us went to Los Angeles.
Why did you move to Los Angeles?
My mother had chronic asthma and bronchitis, and she first tried living in Denver for a few months because there was a sort of a supposition among the people that the air was cleaner in the Rocky Mountains in Denver. But she lasted there only about a year, and then she decided to move out to Los Angeles. And my brother Leon and William, William was there for a short time, but then he entered the Army right after Pearl Harbor. No, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, because at that time they started the draft. And he had a number which would have enabled him to stay out of the Army for some time. But he wanted, at that time he was taking evening courses in accounting at Northwestern University. And as soon as he finished a semester, he decided he better spend 1 year in the Army and then come back and finish his education, rather than wait until they drafted him. And that was just in May of 1941. Pearl Harbor occurred in December 7th, 1941. But William's year in the Army turned out to be 4 years, because when the war started, all bets were off. And so he never did get back to Northwestern to continue his education in accounting. As a matter of fact, he was killed after 4 years being overseas. He was killed on the island of Cebu, which is a little island off of the main Philippine island Luzon. He was an infantryman, and he had a rough life.
What were you able to write to him when he was in the Army?
Yes, well, he wrote to me occasionally, but he also wrote frequently to my mother and father. And he sent us some pictures, some copies of which I have. He never complained about being in the Army, but he saw lots of combat on Guadalcanal and Bougainville, and then in the Philippines.
What did Sam do in Chicago, and when did he move to California?
Well, he got married, I can't remember the year, but he was working in Stop and Shop, which was a big food supermarket. They didn't have supermarkets those days. This was the nearest thing to present-day supermarket, and it was in downtown. It was in downtown Chicago, and he married a shixie, rather not an intelligent girl, but low class. And my mother was sick, was made very ill by this whole thing that happened. But Sam stuck with her, and he stayed in Chicago.
What kind of work did he do?
I just told you he worked.
I'm sorry.
Oh, he was in the candy department, I think.
The what department?
Candy.
Candy.
He was primarily a salesman, a clerk.
And Leon, what did he do?
Leon worked in Hillman's department store. This is what I remember at that time. They had other jobs, I'm sure, but I remember most the time he was in Hillman's, which is another food store. Stop and Shop is a high class one, and Hillman's is an ordinary superstore, but it's owned by the same Jewish people, and it was in downtown Washington. I mean downtown Chicago, and he worked in the fish department. And every time I visited him there, I had to hold my nose. But Leon was a hard worker.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to school in Chicago?
I went to, when we first moved to Chicago, we lived on the west side, which was a Jewish ghetto. And we lived there for a year or two, and then we moved to the Humboldt Park neighborhood. What was your question?
Where did you go to school in Chicago?
I went to, I don't remember the grammar school that I went to, but I went to Thule High School. In those days, they had, each senior high school had a branch, which was sort of like, corresponds to middle school, I suppose. So I went to the Sabin branch of Thule High School first, and then I went to, what's the name of it? Manly High School, which is on the west side. So I got this wrong. We first moved to the Douglas Park neighborhood, then we went down to the west side. Manly High School was on the west side. And 2/3 of the students there were Jewish and 1/3 were Italian. And I had Italian friends and Jewish friends.
Did everybody get along well?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. And then in California, how old were you when you moved there?
Well, I stayed, my mother and the family moved to California just after I graduated high school, and I was maybe a few months afterwards. But I stayed in Chicago and lived with my aunt and uncle, Morris and Fanny Posner, because I was in the middle of the semester at Herzl Junior College. Herzl Junior College was a converted grammar school right in the middle of the neighborhood, the west side. And it was one building. It was nothing like a college that any college you've seen in these days. I went there 1 year, and then I went to Los Angeles, and I spent 2 years at Los Angeles City College, which is also a community college.
And what were you studying at the City College?
I was good in math in high school and at Herzl. And when I took physics in high school, my 3rd year, I was fascinated by the subject because what fascinated me about it is that it explained how things work. And I think you would be interested in that. I mean, you have that same kind of interest. So I decided I wanted to do physics.
So you decided that while you were in college in LA?
No, at Herzl Junior
At Herzl. Oh. And then where did you go?
Then when I went out, after that 1 year at Herzl Junior College, I joined the family in Los Angeles, and I went to Los Angeles City College. I went there. Let's see. I guess it was for 2 years. Yes. And then when I graduated, I took a competitive exam that was given nationally for applying, and the winners were awarded scholarships to the University of Chicago, and I won a scholarship. So then in 1940, let me see, Pearl Harbor was 1940. In 1942, I went back to Chicago. I stayed at Lil's house. Lil was married then.
What was Lil doing in Chicago?
She had all married Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Singer, and they were living there.
What was Joe doing?
He worked for his uncles. He had 2 uncles who had a clothing business, which was wholesale. That is, they would sell clothing at wholesale lots to small clothing stores all over the Chicago area and even beyond, I think. And Joe used to deliver these and sell and find new customers for their clothing business.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, so you came back to Chicago.
Yeah. And I took physics courses there. After the first semester, first quarter ended. This was 1942. It was just after Pearl Harbor, the September after Pearl Harbor, that I entered the University of Chicago. And sometime in November or December, then we were at war. Sometime in November or December, recruiters came to visit us and give us pep talks and ask us to enlist in their reserve corps. I had been registered for the draft, but I was way down the list. But they made these tempting offers. They said, if you enlist in our service, the Navy and the Army each said this, we will let you stay in college until you get your bachelor's degree. And then when you graduate, we'll send you to officers candidate school. And I decided I better do this because if I depend on the draft, I'll probably be drafted before I finish anyway. So the idea of being able to finish, get the bachelor's degree appealed to me, and so I decided I was going to enlist. But I didn't know which, I thought about which should I enlist in. And I made my decision on the basis of one thought. I imagined myself floating in the ocean waiting for the sharks to get to me. So I enlisted in the Army. And the Navy recruiters, the Navy stuck to its promise. The Army did not. I enlisted, I guess, in maybe November, December. And a month later, I got a letter, you will report for active duty. And I, at some camp, some reception center in Michigan. And I remember that lonesome train ride. I was all alone, and here I was entering the Army before I could get my degree. And when I arrived there at this camp, I'll try to remember the name, I can't think of it now, I was surrounded by thousands of draftees. And even though I had enlisted in the Army and was promised to go to OCS, I was indistinguishable from all those thousands of draftees.
Did you ever go to OCS?
No, I was interviewed when I was in my basic training, but the three officers who were sitting at the table who were interviewing me, and I agreed that I was not made to lead men in combat. So I didn't go to OCS. I could have, but I didn't want to. I had my field training, I had my basic training in the field artillery. And I was in a group, special group that was learning in the Fire Direction Center, we were called. And we had all kinds of tables that showed what angle you have to, at what angle you have to set the cannon to land at a certain spot. And you have to take into account wind resistance and all kinds of other things. It's all done on tables. They didn't have computers then. But that was basic training. That lasted 3 months. And then I was sent to ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And the Army had decided they needed more engineers, and so they sent large numbers of us who had certain level of grades. You see, when you first enter the Army, you take some intelligence tests. And the guys who scored well on those tests were sent to these colleges to learn engineering. I was sent to Texas Technological College in hub of the plains, Lubbock, Texas, where we were learning electrical engineering. I was learning something about electrical engineering. Before we finished that course, the Army decided they needed lots of real fighting soldiers, because they were at that time they were organizing the invasion of Europe by the troops that were training in England. So most of the guys who were in the ASTP program were sent to England to as replacements in infantry divisions that were getting ready to go into Europe. Fortunately, our group was sent to the Signal Corps. So the ASTP program didn't last very long. The Signal Corps is that branch of the Army which is responsible for all communications between the headquarters down to the troops in the foxholes, and to the communications between generals and all the communications of the Army. I was assigned to a group that was going to operate repeaters, and I'll tell you what a repeater is. It's nothing but an amplifier. So if you're laying telephone lines over long distances, if it's too long a distance, the signal will be so attenuated that the person at the other end won't be able to hear it. So in between, you install amplifiers, devices which amplify the signal that is at that point, so that it gets amplified as it goes down, and so it can be heard at the other end. Now, part of that was that when you're in mountainous terrain, you can't lay down wires. You see, all of this was done by wires, but you can't lay down wires in mountainous terrain. It's too difficult, and so there were places that I guess were expected to be encountered in Japan, because we were preparing for the invasion of Japan. When you came to a place that was too difficult to lay down wire, you would put that electrical signal into a radio transmitter, and that radio transmitter would transmit the signal through the space using electromagnetic waves. And at the other end, there will be a radio station which will receive that signal and send it on through the wires. So that's what we were that's the kind of equipment we were training to operate. And I spent, I guess, a year, maybe a little more than a year, at Camp Crowder, Missouri, which was one of the two main Signal Corps camps. The other one is in New Jersey. And after about a year of training at Camp Crowder, Missouri, we were sent to India. We went on a troop ship that left Los Angeles Harbor in, let's see, early 1945. And that troop ship took us to Bombay, India. It took 1 whole month to get there because we followed a zigzag path across the Pacific Ocean, hopefully to avoid Japanese submarines. I should tell you that on that trip, I was miserable. I was seasick most of the time. And as a matter of fact, one of my worst memories of that trip is that on the first night out to sea, I should tell you that on a troop ship there are 5,000 GIs crowded together, sleeping on bunks, one above another, 5 or 6 bunks high, and everything is congested, and you get only 2 meals a day, and you eat breakfast in the morning and dinner at night, and you have to stand in a line of 1,000 GIs ahead of you before you get served. But anyway, you get the food, and you carry it into this big room that has long counters, and you put down your trays along that long counter on both sides. And our platoon was together, so we were close to each other. And on the first night out, I puked on my friend's tray right across from me and on my own tray. That guy, by the way, his name was, I don't remember it now, but he later, many years later, became a big official in the Department of Defense, but he died of cancer very early. Atwood, Tom Atwood or something like that. Anyway, so that trip took 1 whole month. The only land we ever saw was we stopped at the port regiments. So our company was sent to the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains, close to a city called Dehradun, Dehradoon, I think. In the northwest. Dehradun is in the northwest part of India, in the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains. We were put up in a British camp, so we shared this camp with the British soldiers. What we were doing there is training to operate. We already knew. I've already mentioned to you that when you're in mountainous terrain, you have to sometimes transfer the signal from the wires to the radios, and then send it by line of sight communication of electromagnetic waves, which don't care about the altitude. And so we set up radio transmitters and receiver stations on various peaks. And some of us were at one peak, another group of guys were at another peak, and we practicing using that equipment, sending the messages via radio. Why were we doing this? In the first place, there weren't any Japanese. We were 1,000 miles from the closest Japanese soldier. Why were we sent there? They never tell you anything in the Army, but the conclusion we came to was we were training to operate this radio equipment shipped to shore when we invade Japan in the future. That's what we thought our mission was. Of course, the war ended before we had a chance to I'll get to that later, before we had a chance to use the equipment in combat. I should tell you first, I'd like to tell you a lot of things. In this camp, our camp was right next to a buffalo dairy camp. In other words, they milked the buffalo for their milk. And so we used to drink that buffalo milk. It was pretty strong, but we got used to it. And let me see. Oh, another thing about that area is that when you go further up into the mountains, there are at that time, Great Britain had an empire, and India was part of the empire, and there were a lot of important military and civilian officials who ran the civil service of India, and when they wanted to cool off, they would go up to certain resorts in the mountains. And on one particular weekend that we had free time, we took the bus up to one of those resorts in the mountains. And for entertainment, the British Rajas had German prisoners of war who had learned how to do the Indian dancing as performers, entertainers. I thought that was quite interesting. They brought these German prisoners of war there who who were fascinated by the Indian type of music and dancing. Okay, that's, now, let me see, I'll finish with that. Then when the war ended, we were sent down to, we weren't needed anymore. We didn't need to get this training anymore because we weren't going to invade Japan. So we were sent back down to New Delhi, which is the capital of India, and which was the headquarters of all the U.S. Army headquarters in that whole region, called the China-Burma-India Theater. I have to tell you that I have to go back. When I was a student at the University of Chicago, those 6 months before I entered the Army, the Manhattan Project was going on our campus. The Manhattan Project was the place where Fermi, Enrico Fermi, built the first nuclear reactor, the first device which uses the energy that the potential energy which is in the atom of uranium, and when that atom absorbs a neutron, the atom splits, and it had a lot of potential energy while it was wrapped up within itself. But when it opens up, it flies apart with very high energy. And so that's how nuclear reactors work. They the neutrons, you produce neutrons inside the region, and the uranium-235 nucleus absorbs when it absorbs a neutron, it flies apart with great energy, and when millions of uranium atoms are doing that, then you have a source of energy. Fermi built the first pile, they called it, first reactor, in the stands at the University of Chicago while I was there, in the stands under the stadium seats. It was all very secret, and it was surrounded, the whole region, and many of the buildings in which we took our math and physics courses, the two buildings which we took our math and physics courses, parts of those buildings were blocked off for all this secret work that was going on behind those walls. And a lot of great physicists were working there at that time. I didn't know who they were. Fermi was there, Wigner was there, a lot of others.
Anderson.
Well, Anderson is only a trainee of Fermi's. But I'll tell you a funny story about that. One of my fellow physics students who knew more about physics than I did, I guess, said, "You know who's working behind that wall, those walls?" And I said, "No, who?" He said, "Enrico Fermi." I said, "Who's he?" And that's how little I knew. And now I go back to the mountains of the Himalayas. I was at one of those radio stations one night, and we could also hear the civilian radios. And I heard, a big explosion in Hiroshima with a new weapon called an atom bomb. By the way, it should be called a nuclear bomb, not an atom bomb, because the energy comes from the nucleus, not from the atom. Dynamite gets its energy from the atom, the electrons of the atom. But this is a nuclear bomb. And immediately I knew what was happening behind those walls. See, I didn't know what was going on there. I thought they were, since they called themselves the metallurgical lab, I thought they were developing armor but that's what the metallurgical lab was, and that's what was going on while I was at the University of Chicago, those few precious 4 or 5 months before I went to the Army.
So you connected it immediately?
Oh, immediately I knew what it had to be.
Really?
Yeah. Well, they called it an atom bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And by that time I knew who Fermi was. Fermi was a pioneer in nuclear physics. He was one of the world's great physicists of the 20th century. And at his funeral, famous physicist
Niels Bohr?
No, not Niels Bohr. Guy who was I can't remember his name. One of the great theoretical physicists of the 20th century gave the memorial address at Fermi's memorial session. And he said Fermi was the last of the all-around physicists. He could do experiments and theory also. And most physicists specialize in one or the other. All right, that finishes that. So, we were set, so after the war ended, oh, another thing I have to tell you. People tell me we shouldn't have exploded that bomb. And I tell them that very few Japanese prisoners were taken. They committed harikari, or they flew these suicide planes into our ships. They had to die for the emperor. They didn't. Very few of them surrendered. If we had invaded Japan, at least we would have to annihilate a good fraction of the army, because they wouldn't surrender. They would, and if we had done that, it's very likely that Alan, your dad, would not have been born, because we were going there. So I tell everybody, I'm so thankful that I was able to bring Alan into the world, and you and your brother Thomas. After the war, we were sent down to New Delhi, which was the capital of India, and also the headquarters of the China-Burma-India Theater. And they just put us in odd jobs until they could send us home. So we spent, I think, about almost a year there. And I was given the important job of being a switchboard operator at the headquarters. That is, in those days, everything wasn't done electronically. So if somebody makes a call, I get it I get their message that they want such and such, they want to speak to such and such. It was mostly communications between generals and diplomats. They want to speak to General so-and-so. And there's a place for me to plug in, make the connection between that caller and this general. So that's what I was, a switchboard operator. Then finally I came home. I came home to Los Angeles, and one other thing I have to mention. When we were in this camp, this British camp, I mentioned two things about this British camp. First thing, it was very hot up there, even in the foothills of the Himalayas. And so during lunch hour, we lived in four in a big tent. We would pull up the sides of the tent so some air could get through. And we would take off our clothes and lie on our cots and just try to cool off. While we were doing that, the British soldiers who were there were playing soccer. So there's an expression, only mad dogs and Englishmen are go out in the midday sun. But the other thing I have to tell you is that one day when we were lying in our cots in the tent, orderly from the captain's office, from the headquarters of our company, came to me and said, Lieutenant so-and-so would like to see you in the orderly room. Of course, when you're told that, you have to go. So I went there. They told me, your brother was killed in action. And that dumbfounded me, but I went back to the tent, and one of the guys in the tent was a nice guy, but he was an anti-Semite. And he said to me, "Are you really Jewish?" Implying that Jews don't fight. So that's the end of that camp. One last thing. I'm a lifelong liberal. So Franklin Roosevelt, to me, he was our president for 4 terms. He's the only president I knew. He was a hero to all of liberals and all Jews. And a good fraction of my friends were Republicans. And one day when we went to the mess hall to get our food out of our tin cans into our kits, one of the most conservative of the guys came up to me and said, "Hey, your hero's dead." said, what do you mean? He said, FDR just died. That was a bad moment for me. Okay, so now we finally went home. And this time, instead of going across the Pacific, we went the other way. We went through the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, and then across the Atlantic Ocean. So we went completely around the world. Now, the trip back, the Mediterranean Ocean was very nice, very calm. I didn't get seasick. But then we had to go through the Straits of Gibraltar and go into the Atlantic Ocean. That happened at night. That night, I and at least half or maybe more of the GIs on that ship, and there were 5,000 of us on it, packed together, not only got seasick, we also had, what do you call it?
Dysentery.
Dysentery. We were going out through both ends. That was the worst night of my life. And the Atlantic Ocean was rough, but we made it home. And
Wait a minute.
okay.
You want me to take over for a little bit?
Well, we made it, I guess, to New York. Oh yes, I think it was New York. I think I saw the Statue of Liberty. And from there, they sent us to some army camp, in Michigan. And there we were discharged. And they gave me enough money to take a train out to Los Angeles. So I came home, and my mother, see, when you're in the Army, you have to have an insurance policy. And my mother got paid off for my son's death $10,000, and she bought a house. And that's where we lived. And then my mother, who was a very active person, convinced Henry's family, that's the Rabanowitzes, to come out to California, and some others. But we lived in Los Angeles I was in Los Angeles for, I guess, a year and a half. While I was in Los Angeles with the family, I went to Los Angeles City College, and it was a good school. But then I had a yearning to go back to the University of Chicago, since they owed me some. I mean, I had a scholarship coming to me, but I didn't need it now because there was a GI Bill of Rights. Because everybody who served in the Army or Navy, if wanted to go to college, the Army would pay their tuition. The service would pay their tuition. The government would pay their tuition. So that's how I went to UCLA. But the tuition at UCLA was not very high because it was a state university. But anyway, they paid my tuition. And I went there for a year and a half, but I got a yearning to go back to the University of Chicago. So I have to go back now to what happened when I was called to the Army while we were living in while I was a student at the University of Chicago. I did very good work in a course taught by a well-known professor there. 2 courses, mechanics, analytical mechanics. And when I got this notice from the Army, you will report on such and such a date to this reception center, I went to, I have to tell you that at that time, there was a whole company of Air Corps cadets who were learning meteorology at the university. They would march to and from classes, and they were learning meteorology to become weathermen for the Air Corps. And they looked real handsome in their uniforms, and I thought, oh, this is good. Meteorology is part of physics. I'll learn some meteorology, hopefully, and be a weatherman. So I I went to this professor who gave me very good grades, and I said I have to go to the Army, and I wondered if I was thinking maybe I could get into this Air Corps training program for weathermen. Would you write a letter of recommendation for me? And he wrote a letter. Turns out that he wrote it in front of me, and I could see it. It was very complimentary. So I went over to the office of the Air Corps cadets, and they said, "Oh no, we're not taking any more people. As a matter of fact, we're dismantling this program because we have more weathermen than we need now." But I kept that letter, which was one of the wisest decisions of my life, because when I was in Los Angeles and I decided I wanted to go back to the University of Chicago, I applied for admission to the graduate school. And I sent in that letter as one of my letters of recommendation. At that time, that professor was the chairman of the physics department. So I didn't have any trouble getting admitted. But they would have admitted me anyway, because I had been a student there before I went to the Army.
Who was that?
Huh?
Who was the professor?
Zachariasen. He was an expert on crystal analysis of solids, crystalline structure of solids.
That's where he got the couch in his office.
Yes, I inherited his couch. So I went back to the University of Chicago, and there I found out that the higher you go, the stiffer the competition. And I realized then that there were a lot of guys who were a lot smarter than I. You always find this out, no matter how high you go, unless your name is Einstein or Fermi. But nevertheless, I did all right there. You know, I took one course from Fermi, and there was a famous theoretical physicist named Wenzel who was, I audited his course. But and Teller was there, but I didn't have any contact with Teller. These are names that if you ever study physics of the 20th century, you'll hear those names. In those days, you had to, after the first year in the department, you had to pass an examination based on all of the undergraduate courses and the first year graduate courses. That was called a qualifying exam. If you pass that exam, then you can go to the professors and ask to do research with one of them to get a PhD. Now, while I was in that first year of graduate work at Chicago, I became a close friend of a guy, a southerner from Florida, Tom Woods. And we studied for the qualifying exam together. And we took that exam at the end of the year, and he got the highest score, and I got the second highest score. He later became a professor in biophysics at the University of Pennsylvania. But both of us decided that the competition was too stiff and the atmosphere was too competitive. We didn't like that. We didn't like just being in this competitive atmosphere. So he decided to go to another university, I think it was University of Pennsylvania. And I decided that I wanted to try my hand at doing practical physics, because I knew I would never be a theoretical physicist like some of those guys. Two of them won Nobel Prizes later, and two others won Nobel Prizes in experimental physics. So there was a lot of competition.
Who were they?
The theoretical physicists were two Chinese guys, Li and Yang.
Mm-hmm.
And the two experimentalists that I knew at that time, one was, he discovered the antiproton at Berkeley. I can't remember his name.
Chamberlain?
Chamberlain, yeah.
Huh.
How do you know?
I asked you about him recently because he recently died.
Oh, and the other one was in theoretical plasma physics. I don't remember his name. Anyway, I decided to try to do some practical physics. So I got a job at Argonne National Laboratory, which is outside of Chicago. And they were working on nuclear energy there. So I got into I was a junior physicist. I did get a master's degree from the University of Chicago, but I didn't feel like doing research for a PhD at that time. So I was in the reactor engineering division, and I was a junior physicist, and I did theoretical calculations about how reactors work, about how the neutrons diffuse and how many collisions they make with uranium atoms and how many neutrons are produced. So you have to produce more neutrons than you put in, otherwise it won't keep itself going. I did theoretical work there, and I did very well. So after 3 or 4 years there, I decided I wanted to go back and get a PhD. And then I went back to the University of Chicago, and I started doing research with Professor Allison. He was an experimentalist in nuclear physics. And I did a certain experiment measuring the passage of helium ions through various gases. That was useful for nuclear physicists. And I got a PhD, and then I went to the Office of Naval Research in Washington. See, at that time I decided I wasn't going to do research. I wasn't going to be a research physicist. I was already in my 30s. You have to be, even if you're creative, but I decided I wasn't creative enough to be a research physicist. So but I wanted to do things related to physics. So I got this job at the Office of Naval Research, and at that time the Navy realized that that military weaponry and everything else in modern life is dependent upon the advance of science. So they established an office called the Office of Naval Research, in which we supported the research being done at universities in the various fields of science, and I was in the nuclear physics branch. So we gave money to professors at various universities throughout the United States to support their research. I'm getting hoarse. I have to take a break.
Okay, we're running out of tape.